This episode of The Minimalists is brought to you by nobody, because advertisements suck.
This podcast has bad words.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Minimalist Podcast, where we discuss what it means to live a meaningful life with less. My name is Joshua Fields Milburn.
And I'm Ryan Nicodemus, and together we are The Minimalists.
Today, we're going to talk about alternative living options, Ryan. It sounds like we're opening up a center.
It does, doesn't it?
The Alternative Living Options Center.
I'm trying to think of the most, crazy living, arrangement like you and I could do. If Mariah moved in with you and then Bex moved in with me, and we were roommates.
That's not unappealing. Actually, yeah, it is. But
yeah, it is. Well, because Mariah is in LA 100% of the time.
Right.
Right. You would never get any alone time.
Yeah, that's true. So there's a bunch of different things we could talk about. By the way, we have Christopher Kelly here from Nourish, Balance, Thrive. Chris, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, there are reasons that you're here. We'll get into that. But at first, I wanted to do an episode sort of about communal living. But I thought maybe that wasn't all-encompassing enough because people had questions about thruples, about combined families, about long-term singlehood, about nomadic living, and a whole lot more. And so I think what happens here, and the reason I found this topic to be so appealing, is we think that there's a way that we're supposed to live. And let me give you first a 30-second overview of Chris. I've known Chris. We've been friends for 5 years or so now.
Years.
And I often say Chris is one of the few people, he and I have some of the best podcasts that we never record.
That's right, on the phone.
Yeah, we just have a phone call and we'll talk for an hour or something. And I'm like, man, I wish we would have recorded this. And now he's here and we can actually record it.
Yeah.
But Chris helped me out with a lot of health things early on when I was starting to figure out some of my health problems.
How did you find
testing.
Chris when you were looking for some help with your health stuff?
Maybe through Ben Greenfield. I'm not
Okay.
entirely
Yeah, that's right.
sure.
Okay.
But that might have been it. And so when I stumbled across Chris and he helped me through a whole lot of, I had mercury poisoning and a bunch of other stuff that was going
You
on.
had all the things, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
C. diff, etc.
Good
And Chris really helped me navigate the beginning of that. NourishBalanceThrive.com. If you've got health issues, you want to talk about that. We're not talking about health stuff today, although we're talking about a component that directly affects our health.
I think so. It might be the most important and hardest problem I've had to try and solve,
Oh, yeah. So let's talk about the problem. In fact, you wrote down here that you're a zookeeper for obligatory gregarious Homo sapiens. What does that mean?
I think this is a good segue into ancestral health, right? So what I meant by that was imagine you are a zookeeper and some new species of upright bipedal ape shows up at your zoo, and you've got to figure out how you're going to look after them, right? So what are you going to do? You're going to keep them in separate enclosures? Are you going to put them all in together? Are you going to make them sign a contract saying that they'll never put their genitals near another ape? Are you going to feed them Subway and Pizza Hut? Or are you going to feed them? What are you going to do? How are you going to design that zoo, right? You have infinite degrees of freedom.
It reminds me of this place, Ryan, in Ohio, where they used to have that chimp where he would smoke and eat candy bars all the time.
Yeah, that was so sad.
And I wouldn't do that.
Right, exactly. And this is what they did do. Look up the story of Guy the gorilla. Was a gorilla that showed up at London Zoo. And in the beginning, they didn't really know how to keep gorillas in captivity. And they allowed the guests at the zoo to actually feed Guy. And eventually he died of cardiovascular disease and diabetes, just like humans do.
Oh, wow.
Right.
But through that, they learned a lot about how to look after gorillas in captivity. And they don't do that anymore, right? And you look at how they keep gorillas in captivity. It's amazing. We were at San Diego Zoo looking at their gorillas recently. It's absolutely incredible. The enclosure is so much thought has gone into that enclosure. And the diet, it's not exactly like the diet a gorilla would eat in the wild, but it's really close, right? You can go to the local supermarket and reconstruct a diet that's really close to what the gorilla would eat in the wild. Now, my argument is that we should be doing the same as humans, right? We've been on this planet millions of years, our ancestors, walking around under the same light-dark cycle, anatomically modern for probably 300,000 years. And then everything changed, 10,000 years ago. And then in particular...
Now, 10,000 years ago because of agriculture.
Because of the birth of agriculture, that changed. Once we became sedentary, that changed everything. By sedentary, I mean we stopped becoming hunter-gatherers that just wandered the savannah, hunting and gathering, and became sedentary. We settled down, we started growing, we domesticated fire and then plants and then animals, and that changed everything. But of course,
those things domesticated us, as
you could argue
Yuval
that.
Harari would say, right?
You could argue that, couldn't you? That did we domesticate fire or did it domesticate us? Right? It's like an interesting question. But I mean, when you look at the last even 10, 20 years, technology has changed us beyond recognition. Like artificial light at night is a good example. Social media is a really good example. And it would seem that these changes are not great for our overall health. And
they're not great in ways that we don't notice right away. And especially what I've noticed, the younger we are, the more, I won't say immune we are to these external stimuli, but the more resilient we seem to be. But over time, for whatever reason, and I'm sure you have some hypotheses around it, these things affect us negatively. And you, in your practice at nourishbalancethrive.com, you have lots of people who come to you because conventional medicine sort of broke down, wasn't able to find the answers for them. In fact, it wasn't even about finding solutions. They couldn't even identify what the problem is.
Right.
And I've heard you say that a lot of these problems that we deal with now, there isn't like, we get so caught up in silver bullet thinking. And what you like to do is sort of take a more holistic approach. And I think part of that holistic approach has to do with our living arrangements. And that's why I wanted to title this one Unusual Living Arrangements, because it's unusual in the sense that society has sort of prescribed something to us. And by the way, I do want to dive deep into your own communal living. You have a communal living situation. We want to dive deep into that on the Maximal episode. But first, Chris, I want to talk about why you're here today, because, well, it feels like we've been prescribed this way of living. And what you're saying is that prescription, while it may work for some people, it's not natural.
Well, natural, like I'm kind of scared of that word, like it conjures up thoughts of the naturalistic fallacy,
Okay, well, it's not birthed from nature. How about that?
It may not be optimal.
Okay.
And personally, I didn't realize there were choices, like I just conformed to the societal expectations. And then only once I had kids, like that's when the really hits the fan, is when you have kids, you realize, oh, this doesn't actually work very well. Two people at the nucleus, and then however many dependents orbiting like charged particles. We call this the nuclear family. It doesn't work very well.
Now, did it work previous to kids, and only the introduction of kids made it not work? Or was it the introduction of kids that made you say, maybe the whole thing doesn't really work?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that the kids are the straw that broke the camel's back, right? It kind of sharpens it, and you're like, oh, actually, this really doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so where did this idea start of the nuclear family?
Well, I think it's quite modern. There's a really nice piece in The Atlantic I read recently. I think it was like the 1950s, in the US at least. The nuclear family wasn't a thing before the 1950s. And it was an idea, it was a boom time where it could possibly work, where you had dad went off to work on his own and mum stayed home and looked after the kids. And of course now it's not really possible in Silicon Valley. If you want to buy a starter home in Mountain View, then probably both of the parents need to be working a full-time job at Apple or Facebook or Google or something in order to be able to pay the mortgage for, a $2 million starter home. So I think even now, this
phrases
can't
not
work.
go together. We're from Dayton, Ohio.
Right. $2 million, you're like the richest man in the county if you have a $2 million house.
Yeah, it's like, seriously, there are like $2 million starter homes for sure.
That's unbelievable.
And so there's like maybe this moment in time in the 1950s where the nuclear family was an option, it could work. But never since.
Are you arguing that it never works? It doesn't sound to me like that's it either, because it seems to me that like that's the trap that we get caught up in, whereas it's supposed to be one way, as opposed to, yes, there is for lack of a better term, a natural way in which we evolved to become humans, an evolutionary way of living. But of course, we've changed, we've improved upon our lives, we have electricity, and we all think that's for the better. And if we don't think it is, then none of us that I know are completely doing without these things, right? And so I'm wondering if I look at these living situations, these arrangements, it's not to say the nuclear family is bad or wrong or anything like that, but it's not to say that the other way is even right or better. It's to say what is appropriate for you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so how people make the nuclear family work is they purchase the additional social support that would have previously come from the community, right? So people hire, a wet nurse, a postpartum doula, a therapist, a mentor, a tutor, all these different things that normally would have been part of your tribe. Now
So
you just
they're
purchase
hiring a
these things.
community.
I would say so. I mean, don't you think?
Interesting. Yeah.
I never thought of it that way. That's
Yeah,
so
me
true.
either. Yeah, that's a great perspective. Yeah, like they're hiring a daycare. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, even teachers as well.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly when they're young, you're not really teaching. You're just doing babysitting, right? I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it has to go back before that as well, where we started to believe that there was I don't know if it's a puritanical sort of way of thinking, but whatever it is, there's something here where we've been forced into believing we have to live a particular way. And I don't want the reaction to that to be, well, no, that's wrong. Here's the right answer. I think what we're talking about here today is, hey, here are some other options, perhaps. So we're going to get into that. I want to dive deep into Chris's story as well, but I thought we would start with some questions from our audience. We have a question here from Gwen in Athens, Ohio.
How should I go about combating roommates or friends of roommates who steal my material items, such as food or money or self-care?
So Chris, let's rephrase Gwen's question here. Basically say, how do I appropriately set boundaries with the people in my community or in my home or whatever to ensure those boundaries are not crossed? You want to prevent people from stealing, obviously, property damage, but also just tense living situations, right? Now you live in can you talk a bit about maybe your communal situation?
So we've experimented with a number of different configurations over the past year, ranging from like a time segmented type arrangement where for a few days a week we're living with another family. So I've got two kids, one who's a girl who's 7 and a boy who's 3. And we've spent time living under the same roof with another couple who have kids of similar ages.
And
And
how
so
many kids they have?
So we've lived with a number of different families, but I think they've all had 2 kids of about the same ages.
Now, what have you learned from living with these different families? Because Gwen's question here is, you basically have introduced roommates. What we in our today's society would say roommates. It's different from that, but that's how you even have to classify it. It's almost it's euphemistic, right? There was a time not too long ago when gay couples used to have to say they had roommates, as opposed to having a partner or a husband, and so now you are trying these sort of experiments with other families living together. Why did you start doing this?
I think the kids were actually the main driver. I did a podcast interview with Peter Gray, who you might know. He's got a really great book called Free to Learn.
Okay.
And Peter talked about the common word is unschooling.
Yes.
I don't really like that term. Peter doesn't like it either because it focuses on what you're not doing versus what you are doing.
Yeah.
So perhaps a better description is non-coercive, self-directed learning, meaning you're trusting the kid to find the best learning opportunity on their own without you doing much of anything. And in order for that to work, you need older kids, right? I don't care how old your kid is, you need an older kid, because the older kid is like the scaffolding that helps the younger kid up to the next level. So you're not doing the teaching, the older kids are doing the teaching. So I've seen this happen firsthand, where you've got an older kid that can read, and they're looking at words on a screen or a piece of paper, and they're telling the younger kid what they say. So the older kid is actually teaching the younger kid, even though the older kid doesn't know what they're doing.
Yeah, and in that teaching, he or she is also learning through the you learn so much more by teaching than just about any other way.
Exactly. And so the problem is, like, you can't do that with just 2 kids, right? Like, you need more kids than that. And so the question then becomes, well, where do you get more kids? Now, we live in a very rural area where most of the houses are on very large lots. And so there are some kids around in the neighborhood, but not enough. And so we needed to do something bring more kids in,
Mm-hmm.
and that's exactly what we've been able to do, and it's been great.
Well, let's talk a bit more about that.
Yeah.
When you say it's been great, it sounds like you've lived with several different families. Explain that.
Yeah, so we've done a couple of different things. We've had people living in our house. We live in quite a small house. It's about 1,200 square foot. And, that's not very much space when you've got two families living under the same roof.
Yeah.
We've also done other things like having people bring on a trailer. Like these, I don't know if you've seen them, but these travel trailers are tremendous value for money. You can get like a house that's nicer than our house for... $20,000 or something, and you can move it. You can just roll it onto. So we're lucky that we live on quite a large property.
Mm-hmm. We've
We've had people bring on a trailer and use that as a sort of separate space from the main house that can definitely get a little bit crazy at times.
And so how do you navigate these relationships? Because these different people have different desires, different wants, different preferences, different hobbies, different levels of tolerance and different desires. How do you navigate all of that?
Well, I think you start by having similar value systems, right? So ancestral health is super important to us, and it gives us some guiding principles that we operate by. And like finding people that share those values, like I could live with you, it'd be great because I know you eat the same food, you go to bed at the same time. I think we share a lot of things in common. And so it's not that much work to try and close the gap, Sometimes I heard once a lawyer told me that sometimes a case will go to mediation and the judge will just refuse to do anything. They won't try and close the gap because it's just too big. Like there's too much distance between the two sides. And they say, go away, just go sue yourself, go sue each other because this is not a gap I can close. And I think the same is true with like communal living. Like you need to find people that share your value system so that whenever conflict does arise, there's like not that much of a gap to close. And that is indeed what we've been doing. So all of the people we've lived with have had very similar value systems.
Ryan, it sounds like obviously the thing that the best way to deal with conflict within the house, to get back to Gwen's question here, is to screen the roommates beforehand, right?
Right.
I think back to relationships that I've had, whether friendship or intimate relationships. Quite often it's simply a screening problem because, as Chris said, like, we don't have the same values. Of course, with that greater gap means there's going to be greater tension between the two of us.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to Gwen's question, I would, ask her: is there a way to close that gap with her roommates and with her roommates' friends? It sounds like.
Yeah.
If it's not possible, I mean, she could certainly do things like, I don't know. When I had roommates, I would lock my door. It didn't get to the point where I had to get like my own mini fridge because that gap with the particular roommate, who I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
I will not name him to not shame him publicly.
We'll save that for Patreon.
Yeah, exactly. But if I couldn't move out and if I couldn't afford to have moved out, like it would have come to that situation where I would have had to spend like a couple $100 to get my own mini fridge.
Right.
Yeah. So, if the gap is too large, Gwen, she's got to move out.
It's really rough. It's very different from my situation. Like everyone we've lived with has been tremendously respectful, like overly cautious of anything. You know what it's like when you move in with a partner and it's kind of intimidating, right? Like you're moving into their space and you tread really lightly and you're just very respectful. Yeah. That's more similar to my situation versus living in college with a bunch of arsehole roommates that are like fine about taking your food and like that's a very different situation, I think.
Totally.
But even then you have conflict, right? And so there'll be times where maybe you don't agree on a parenting thing.
Yeah.
And how does that work out?
That actually ended one. Yeah, you're right. Like
here we go. Now we're getting into the drama,
the juicy stuff.
Yeah, I thought so. I don't have a parenting style. That's actually Peter Gray talked about that on my podcast as well. Like hunter-gatherers don't do parenting and they don't do teaching either. And I've read some really good books on this. Alison Gopnik, The Carpenter and the Gardener, is a really good one. And I love that metaphor. It's like so relevant for dealing with complex systems, where in carpentry you measure twice and you cut once, and it's like building a dining room table and it's very obvious when the job is done, and you test to see if it wobbles and all this stuff, and then maybe you make some slight refinements, and in the end you've got this perfectly crafted piece of furniture. Whereas in gardening it's mostly about keeping the weeds out and just creating an environment for for the plants to flourish, and you never really know what you're going to get. I mean, of course, you know what seeds you put in the ground, but you don't really know what's going to grow.
Right.
And so what Alison Gopnik is arguing is that parenting is more like gardening and less like carpentry. But a lot of people, they treat it like carpentry, and that in the beginning I thought, I don't care, it's fine if you want to do helicopter parenting, go ahead and helicopter, but I don't have a style, so I should be compatible with any style. But you're right, once they start helicoptering your kids, it's like, oh shit, I can't handle this. And so that actually did end one relationship.
So give me examples of helicoptering. What does that look like in the real world?
I mean, it looks exactly what it sounds like. It's you're literally hovering over the child, micromanaging their every move. And the way it would, I know it was happening, even if I'm not paying attention, is I would hear the kid's name over and over again, over and over again. You're like, wait, why is the person using the kid's name over and over again? And it's because they're constantly trying to direct them towards
control.
The next. It's control, yeah. It's overly controlling.
Now, what about that control is so appealing to us?
I don't know. It's I think one thing I think is going on in Silicon Valley is people are really struggling with purpose. They do, there's this kind of standing joke that the brightest minds in the world are all working in Silicon Valley, getting people to click on stuff, right? It's all these people with PhDs and stuff just getting people to click on stuff. And it's not really scratching people's itch. It's not like a great purpose. And I think it's a really common thing for people to either quit their job or, this is what they do as a hobby. They go all in on parenting,
Yes. It becomes their new obsession.
Yeah, exactly.
I think a lot of the helicopter parenting too probably spawns from good intentions. Maybe you're just trying to protect your kid from not getting hurt, and there's a balance there, right? But yeah, if you're constantly hovering over them, you're not allowing them to flourish themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Good intentions and bad ideas. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, explains the whole thing very well, I think.
Yeah, and I think if we back up and remove ourselves from even the parenting situation, the same thing can happen with roommates or significant others, spouses, whatever. We can become helicopter partners. We can become helicopter roommates, and it quickly becomes an untenable situation. And so it's fascinating to me when we're talking about communal living. Really what you're talking about isn't a traditional commune necessarily, but it's maybe an iteration of that.
What do you mean by commune?
Well, what images does that conjure when I say commune?
It conjures up images, wild country. That was actually, I lied. I said I don't watch TV. We did watch that on Netflix. It was really good. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, I think of gurus. It scares the hell out of me. Somebody, a boss. No.
But it sounds to me like often those intentions of, because here's the thing, we hear about Wild Country, or we hear about Nexium or whatever, these cults, right? And there are so many that you don't hear about because they're actually just communes that are working fine, and there isn't some sex-crazed leader who is making the news. It just happens to be that we hear about the salacious stuff, right? And so we hear about when people are drinking Kool-Aid and killing themselves, and or joining some sort of cult that castrates each other, whatever it is. That stuff makes the news. It doesn't make the news. 4 families decide to live together happily.
Right. Exactly. Lived happily ever after. It's not a great news story, is it?
No. And so, I don't know, do you see this evolving over time as you get acclimated with different families or whatever? Do you see a larger group forming out of this potentially?
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? How much is enough is a very interesting question. Yeah, we've yet to figure out what the ideal number is. I know that things get way better, and my motivation to go find the others goes exponentially down as we add more people. So even one other couple and their kids is so much better than just the nuclear family, in my opinion.
How many families are living on your property right now?
So at the moment, we were in a relationship with another couple that's going really well, and they've got 2 kids who are 11 and just turned 7. And then we've got another neighbor who has a 4-year-old girl who recently put a trailer on our property. And she's more like sort of the time segmented thing, where she'll come for a couple of days a week.
Cool.
And that's, so far so good.
That's great.
It's really new, but so far so good.
Awesome.
I want to talk about your sleeping situation on the Maximal episode, but we have some more to get into. Gwen, I'm going to send you a copy of the Minimalist Rulebook, because one thing we didn't talk about, but it should be self-evident at this point, is boundaries. Now, Now, the first boundary is before you even let the roommate into the house, right? The first boundary is not coming to an agreement with someone who has complete opposite values with you. You know you're setting yourself up for discontent, for quote-unquote failure, for tension, etc., property damage, whatever. Like there's going to be all kinds of things you don't want to get involved in. But even then, like Ryan and I have the same values. We don't always agree on things. In fact, he and I have lived together before. We've had different preferences, and sometimes that just dictates. Yeah. I think what really helped Ryan and I live together was kind of what Chris was saying, is like we didn't just tolerate each other, we respected each other's desires.
Yes.
And in that respect, even if I don't completely understand it, I can completely appreciate the way that you live, and vice versa, as long as you're not harming me or anyone else.
Yeah, and we were totally capable of telling each other if something was bugging us or something, our preferences were being stepped on. Maybe it was very simple to just have a conversation. And I mean, that might just spawn from, I think we have an exceptional relationship in that sense, where like we can deliver the truth to each other in a way, even if it sounds negative, like we don't take it negatively, we just kind of take it for what it is.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that's unfortunately a rare thing in relationships, but I think the closer people can get to that in their relationships, to not be offended when someone's like, hey, I'd really appreciate it if you X, Y, or Z. That would create some better living situations for sure. Yeah.
I found 5 words that are really useful for me as well. Would you be willing to?
Would you be willing to shut up?
But instead of like, hey man, how come you always leave your salt crumbs on the counter?
Yeah.
Hey, would you be willing to clean those up?
Yeah.
This not in a patronizing way, but hey, would you be willing to? And those have disarmed so many arguments in my life, but also shows just a common respect. And I think another way to show respect is to set boundaries up. So we have the Minimalist Rule Book. It's 16 rules for living with less. You can download it for free over at theminimalists.com/rulebook. Also, the audiobook version is available there as well, or you can get the free ebook there. Just download it, theminimalists.com/rulebook. Ryan, what time is it?
You know what time it is. It is time for our lightning round, where we answer your text messages. You can text your questions and comments to area code 937-202-4654.
Yes, indeed. So during the lightning round, Chris, you're familiar with this. This is where we do our best to answer questions with a short, shareable, less than 140 character response. We put the text to these minimal maxims in the show notes so people can copy and share our pithy answers on social media if they'd like. Oh, and you can find all of our minimal maxims in one place now, minimalmaxims.com.
I love like getting random tweets with things that I've said and they quote me, and I'm like, oh yeah, I did say that. Like, that was good.
They're all in the show notes, so you can copy and
like,
share
that's
those.
a genius quote. Who came up with, oh, that was me? Thank God for the website, because I would not remember all of them.
Yeah. We got a question here from Eric.
All right. Are there countries, tribes, societies where unusual living arrangements, for example, communal living, thruples, combined families, long-term singlehood, nomadic living, isn't actually unusual? How happy are these people with these arrangements? What are the pros and cons of these arrangements?
Okay, Chris, so there's 3 questions here in the lightning round. This is what we do during the lightning round. It's actually our longest segment.
Yeah.
Strangely.
Right.
So I do have a pithy answer, and I want to unpack it with you, and then I want to hear what you have to say. So here's my pithy answer. Searching for pros, in quotes, tethers us to the cons. And so I think that it's okay to learn the negative and positive lessons from yesteryear. Yeah. But I find that whenever I take a piece of paper out and make the line down the middle, here's the pros on this side and here's the cons, it's an intellectual exercise, but it doesn't really help with a deeper understanding of our nature. Mm-hmm. And so I think in these situations, because they're so complex, it's not like, do I want to buy the Honda Accord or the Toyota Camry? Okay, the pro-con list probably going to help out with that.
Sure.
Even then, you probably know which one you want, and the pro-con list is irrelevant.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing might be true with our living situations. Mm-hmm. You've been told, you've been prescribed that here's what you must do. At age 22, you're supposed to get married, and you have 3.5 kids and a dog and a cat, and you live in this house and a yard and a fence. Nothing wrong with any of those things. They're not going to make you happy. They're externalities. Happiness and peace are only uncovered, right? And so you asked a moment ago, what is enough? Maybe if I were to pin that, I would say, well, what is appropriate for your life, for your preferences? And it seems to me that, like, Chris, the situation you're in, I would not like that at all. Now, it's not because I think it's wrong. I think that I spend most of my time alone, so I think that being around more people is going to decrease my tranquility in a way.
Yeah, that's a weird perspective, isn't it?
Mine?
I think
Yes.
so. And you know, weird is actually an acronym here. It's
Yes.
westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
Uh-huh.
There's a really good book called The Weirdest People in the World by Joe Henrich,
Uh-huh.
where he writes about this phenomena and includes the big 5 personality traits. Introversion is one of them, and it's unique to weird societies.
Yes.
So the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, these are all weird places, right?
Right.
And introversion does not exist in hunter-gatherers. It just doesn't make any sense. If you think fierce egalitarian, if your existence depends on sharing, right? The best place to store food is in the belly of my brother.
Yes.
Then where does introversion fit into that? And it doesn't. And when they go examine hunter-gatherers and ask them questions that should identify these big 5 personality traits, they don't find them.
But what about, so the most enlightened people in history have all gone off, we can take away the terms introvert and extrovert for the sake of this, and had large stretches of solitude. Now, that could be because they're trying to beat the culture out of them.
Right.
That ruined the hunter-gatherer nature. And so the Buddha, for example, had to go off for 7 years, supposedly eating a grain of rice a day or something absurd.
Right.
And in doing that stillness, the solitude, the alone time, it almost was like a deprogramming of the culture in a way, or of society.
Yeah, I really like Cal Newport's definition of solitude. I know you know him. I've
Yes.
heard him on the podcast. I interviewed him too.
Yeah.
And do you remember him talking about solitude as a state that you can achieve anywhere, right? You can have solitude in a coffee shop working surrounded by people and noise.
Yeah.
It's the absence of input from another human mind, which ultimately is your choice, right? So you can still have solitude in my chaotic living room with a bunch of kids bouncing around between the walls, right? If you choose not to get tugged around by every input that comes your way. So I think it's a choice. I think you can still have solitude in a noisy environment.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I call it ambient people. Like, I like to write in coffee shops quite often.
Yeah.
But where I disagree is, like, you can, but you can't if people are demanding your attention. And so if I am saying, hey, Ryan,
Right.
and he's trying to be in solitude, he's either going to have to be a total jerk to me, but I'm really the one being the jerk because I'm constantly, Ryan.
Yeah.
But, like, him not reciprocating, that is actually going to hurt our relationship. And so that's what I'm talking, when I talk about boundaries even, like figuring out what is appropriate in my life. And so, yeah, I have a unusual living arrangement. My wife and I have separate places in separate states, and we spend every other week apart. And in doing that, it's the most ideal scenario for us, given our current constraints. However, if I was forced into your situation, could I make it work? Yeah, I could, but I don't know that it would be optimal for me. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, I wouldn't deny that. Again, it's like choosing people that share that value system. Like, you're probably a bunch of introverts are probably not going to work together. But there is also an economy of scale there. So imagine you've got a bunch of kids. It's like really hard for you to have alone time. But if the kids are all happy together, I mean, I can look after 5 kids as easy as I can look after 2 kids. And so maybe in the end, you end up with more alone time. Like, you can go off and take a walk and do whatever you want to do because I'm there to take care of your kids. And actually, it makes my life easier when there are more kids.
Yeah. I
So
think
it's
that makes
kind
a
of
lot of sense. Yeah.
A sort of paradox there, like it seems like you're getting less time alone, but in the end, you will end up with more.
Yeah, because I know right now, like, with having just one kid, and we don't even have her full time, right? But when we have her, it's 2 parents parenting one child.
Parenting the activity, not the relationship.
Yeah. It's like we're just, and so it's a strange thing because if she had more siblings, then it would actually ease.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. So you know about this. So having multiple kids, as you're going through these living situations, is there anything that you found to be your sweet spot that you think is applicable to other people between how many people you're living on the same sort of commune with?
I honestly don't know the answer to that yet.
Yeah.
We've been doing.
What do you
doing
suspect?
it a year.
Is it big? Is it 20 people? Is it 40 people?
Yeah, I suspect that once you get to a certain number, you then start having problems with communication. You know, that it then becomes like a sort of, you have to have like democratic processes and keeping everybody on the same page. I can imagine that would start to become inefficient, but we've not found enough people. I mean, that's part of the reason why I'm here today, is to try and find some more like-minded people.
Well, how do they find you?
Oh, well, you can find me at my email address, chris@nourishbalancethrive.com.
Uh-oh. Be careful what you ask for, Chris.
I'm moving to Santa Cruz.
Let's see. So back to Eric's questions here. When we're talking about, and obviously on the Maximal episode, we'll talk more about, we have a whole article about thruples, combined families, long-term singlehood as well, nomadic living. And so what you're doing isn't nomadic living because you're in one place.
We're still sedentary.
Right,
Yes.
but it is, from our societal standpoint, it's semi-nomadic in a way, meaning you're not tethered to that place. You're not commuting to the same job every day, etc. Even though you have a career, you could do that from pretty much anywhere.
Yeah, no, we would be totally happy to move somewhere else for the right opportunity. You know? And maybe that's the right thing to do. That's the problem we've got right now, is California is so ridiculously expensive that maybe we just need to find a plot of land in Texas or Colorado or somewhere like that, where it's, or Montana actually would probably be a good option, where it's so much cheaper.
Yeah. Although it's very cold there in the winter.
I know. That's why everyone wants to live in California. It's sunny and nice, and it's
Can't
great
beat the
where I am.
weather. Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
It's like Florida's got summer year round, but the humidity, that's the thing that keeps people away from Florida.
Yeah. Summer in Florida, man.
Yeah.
So
brutal.
Ryan, I'm looking here at Eric's question, how happy are these people in these arrangements? Again, I think this is highly individual, right?
Yes.
And that's why I don't think there is a supposed, not that I think, there is no supposed to. We were not born to live in a nuclear family, but it's not wrong to live in a nuclear family either.
Yeah.
It may be the most appropriate thing for you, but instead of, here's the problem I have, Chris, is we often feel I'm supposed to do this thing, right? Because society and culture has convinced me it's the quote unquote right thing to do. But now I'm feeling discontented by it. And it's not that, I'm saying you shouldn't do the thing that society's telling you to do. It's that knowing that you're better off if you know that it's not the thing that you have to do. And therefore, if you do decide to intentionally embark on a nuclear family and you have the American dream or whatever, and you're contented by that, great, but it's not the prescription.
Well, it is the prescription of the Catholic Church. It depends. So I think that's important to understand where this came from. That's what Joe Henrich wrote about in his book, is that the monogamous nuclear family is an invention of the Catholic Church in the 4th century. And it was the best money-making system ever, right? You couldn't get divorced. You couldn't adopt a child. You could only pass on your money to your son and heir.
Yeah.
I mean, just biologically speaking, at some point, you're not going to produce a son and heir.
Right.
And if you don't produce a son and heir,
it all goes to the church.
It all goes to the church. And at some point, the Catholic Church end up owning, like a third of Germany. It was like the best business model ever.
Oh, wow.
And so that's where it originates. That's where the idea originates. And so, I mean, if you don't really subscribe to the ideas put out by the Catholic Church, and the Protestants weren't much better. They just kind of even, took it to extremes. But Joe Henrich writes about that history in his book, so I'd recommend that.
Now, you're not saying that no one was monogamous previous to that. You're saying it was not the default setting of the culture at the time.
No, I don't think anyone was monogamous before that. And I think that even to this day, like the idea that the monogamous nuclear family is unique to weird societies, right? There are still places around today where they don't do, like, cousin marriage is really common. You know, polygamy is still a thing. Like, it's only, I mean, we don't know because we're inside of this bubble and we can't really see out.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's definitely going to be people listening to this that are saying, yeah, of course, like this monogamous nuclear family thing. Why would you do that? Stupid.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Interesting.
it's funny though, because I don't think that this is where I push back. I don't see it as stupid, but maybe this is just my acculturation. Like I've been forced to think it's not that it's not stupid. I don't think it's stupid or not stupid.
Yeah.
I think it's there's a reason that we've continued to do it for a prolonged period of time.
Right.
Now, it may not work for the average person listening to this, or it might work for you. And so it's hard for me to say that it's stupid, because I kind of do feel that in a way.
Yeah.
Like there's something in me where I'm like, yeah.
Let me substitute the word stupid with species appropriate. You know, going back to my human zoo, you wouldn't keep the penguins on hot sand, and you don't keep the humans in monogamous nuclear families, right? Like that's what I'm arguing. It's not species appropriate. I mean, there is an upside to it. The upside, I mean, Joe Henrik writes about that, is economic prosperity. Is you get people who are strangers to cooperate in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. Because the alternative, like a kin-based arrangement, it's like all nepotism, right? Like all the, you know, like all your business goes to someone who's family. Like that's the alternative.
Right.
And that's why the monogamous nuclear family has become so prevalent today, is because of the economic prosperity, which is the upside, right? So,
Ryan, you got anything pithy for us?
Yeah. You know, listening to Eric's question, I think, you know, maybe he's looking at different examples because maybe I don't know, I'm just assuming that maybe he feels that the way he wants to live with his family, maybe it's a little weird. But yeah, I mean, my pithy answer is a genuine life doesn't require someone else's approval. So when I think about your not extroversion, but introversion, like that is strange to me, but it's not strange to you.
Right.
That's you living a genuine life.
Yeah.
So because of that, you know, Josh isn't looking for external approval from other people to be like, well, is it okay that I'm alone?
Although I did do that for the longest time, and it made me miserable.
Oh yeah, it absolutely did, especially during like the corporate days for sure. But you know, I look at this question, the last one about the pros and cons, and we could sit here and maybe we put together a nice pros and cons list for Eric here.
Right.
But there would be our pros and cons.
That's a great point.
And
by the way, what's usual for you could be unusual for me.
Yeah, some people's pros or other people's cons.
I also wrote down here, unusual is usually ideal. So Chris lives in an unusual situation because he's done so deliberately, right?
oh, it's intentional, exactly. Rather than just choosing the societal default.
Instead of charging the decided on the usual thing, right? Accepting the usual thing, you've done something quote unquote unusual, right? And that's what's appropriate for you. Bex and I have done something that is unusual, meaning it doesn't conform exactly to the societal standards. There's a Venn diagram, but there's even a Venn diagram with you, and you know, you have a wife, right? That's that's a relic of your past, right? And if you
She might have something to say about that.
I mean, that's the thing, though, right? Like, you were told that you needed to be married at some point, right? But your hunter-gatherers never married, right?
That's another interesting point, actually, that Joe Henrik argues that what came before monogamy was polygamy, and I had an interesting conversation with our mutual friend Chris Ryan about that. And you know, sort of the short answer is that it really depends how you define marriage. So for some hunter-gatherer bands, or even, you know, indigenous people, they define marriage as like, if I hang my hammock next to yours and we spend the night together, then we're married. And then if I take my hammock somewhere else, then we're not married anymore, right? So it really depends. Like the literature is really hard to interpret because it really depends on how you define marriage. It's like a really slippery thing to define.
No, I totally agree. Yeah, Ryan and I call our significant others our wives, but we don't have a piece of paper that says that we are.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it's because I don't want to get the government involved in our love, and so like and Bex feels the same way. Thankfully, I know Ryan is on the same page, but like it has a lot to do with how do you define marriage. I don't define it as government involvement. By the way, like even our government, people early on, George Washington didn't have a government certificate for his marriage, but he was married. I find that monogamy works really well in Bex's and my relationship. However, we have actually I'm going to save this for the maximal because it's going to get kind of private here. So we'll save that for the private podcast. We got a bunch more questions as well. Also, I do have a communal living themed added value this week.
All right.
But we got some listener comments and tips as well, and a bunch more surprise questions, like what are some examples of successful nomads? How about successful thruples and long-term single people? Don't most societies treat the hoarding of things from past generations, things like sentimental heirlooms, as a net positive? So we have someone arguing for hoarding. And then what have been the unexpected upsides and downsides of communal living for Chris? We've touched on a few of those, but I really do want to get honest about what lessons you've learned there. Plus a million more questions about unusual living situations. And if you want to hear all that, listen to this week's Maximal episode on Patreon. That's right, you're currently listening to our weekly Minimal episode, but each Thursday, Ryan and I and our guest, we record a much longer Maximal episode for the Minimalist private podcast. Visit theminimalists.com/support to subscribe and get your personal link so that our private podcast plays in your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our show and want to support the Minimalists, this is the only way our podcast earns money. It's cheaper than a cup of coffee, and it keeps our show 100% advertisement free. Plus, private podcast subscribers also gain access to hundreds of hours of archives. Ryan, what else you got for us this week?
Here are some voicemail comments and insights from our listeners. Check them out.
Hey, y'all. This is Emily Stewart from Florence, South Carolina, and I wanted to share a tip. So I've been a minimalist my entire life, even as a kid, but I find myself thinking that I don't have anything to get rid of because I'm a minimalist. So I came up with a game with myself that kind of helps me to keep cleaning things out. I often shop at Trader Joe's and Aldi's, and I bring my own bags, but sometimes I forget and end up having to grab the paper bags at checkout. So my new rule for myself is every time I do this, I have to fill up the paper bags with things from my home to give away or sell. So although forgetting my own bags isn't good for the environment, it turned into a great way to consistently clear out and help keep it fun for me and fresh, even though I have been a minimalist for so long.
Mary Rose Coughlin, Vernon, Connecticut. So that's happened to me several times where I've lost a great deal of money in a pocket that I gave away or tipping from the wrong pocket when I had money traveling. And I like to think that that person needed the money more than I did. So whether you say God wanted them to have it or the power of the universe knew they needed it, that person needed the money more than you did. And you're blessed to have an opportunity to share it with them.
All right, y'all, for our added value this week, you saw this, Chris, you saw, what's the name of the Wild Wild Country?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's another docuseries about Nexium. Have you heard about Nexium?
No, I can't wait to watch this. This is great.
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm like fascinated by the cult documentaries that they do, or even the oh man, the reenactment one they did, the series with
the Waco one.
Yeah, with Waco.
Oh yeah,
so
Tyler Kitsch was his name. He
Yeah.
played David Koresh. That was so good.
All right, so tell us about next.
I too am fascinated. And here's why I'm fascinated by this, because I am often fascinated on the trajectory of where you are right now, where you have 2, 3, 4 families living on the same land with kids, whatever. And then all of a sudden, where's the tipping point where it becomes a cult?
all that Chris is missing is a guru.
Exactly. That's the thing, right? Like if you keep it egalitarian, then it can't be a cult. The moment you have a guru, then you're in trouble.
Yes, yeah, but also, there are like great gurus who have no interest in forming a cult whatsoever. Like they don't want a communal. They just want to be teachers or whatever. Maybe that's the difference. They call themselves teachers or masters or whatever.
And it's wild how it always starts with usually something positive. Like, so Mariah has been reading a book, and I don't know what the name of it is, but she was like, "You should really check out this book. It talks about this guy named Osho."
Oh wow!
And
So
she's
this-
like, and she's going on, and I'm like, that rings a bell. Like, where have I heard that name before? And then she's like, oh my god, she's like, I've been reading this Wild Wild Country Guy's book, and I had no idea until she like got 3/4 of the way through it. And she was like, oh wow, this is that Wild Wild Country Guy.
It does seem that Osho was probably an enlightened person, but also had some sort of weird fascination with material.
He was a narcissist, wasn't he? Was
Yeah.
my understanding.
Yeah, maybe.
Well,
I don't
yeah.
know. I mean, or maybe he had no ego at all. Like, I don't
Yeah.
know what that looks like.
I think it doesn't even matter. I mean, personally, I think he trusted the wrong people, and
He did?
yes,
Why was he driving all of these? I mean, there's nothing wrong with Rolls Royce. I don't think he did anything wrong.
No.
I also think he had a lot of wisdom, and so the book she read, I haven't read a whole lot of his stuff.
She's been sharing some of the wisdom, and I'm like, oh, that is a pretty awesome insight. That
Yes.
is pretty great. I mean,
He had a ton of insights.
yeah, but I think absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, maybe that's the point he got to. But I know, like, when I saw Wild Wild Country, I was like, oh, like Osho got to a point where he kind of like put his hands in the air and let everyone else around him run everything.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where it started to go wrong when he stopped, trying. When he, reached nirvana, he was like, all right, I'm here, and I don't really care what happens around me, which
Yeah.
I guess would be.
It could be.
Yeah.
And someone else stepped up and was power hungry, and so there was power struggles.
But even
and
like
everything.
David Koresh, I mean, like watching that docuseries, like it started out where he was, helping people. I mean, he was a little insane. But I guess we're all a little insane, it's a level of how insane are we?
Well, I don't know, Chris, maybe we could talk about that. You have these cults, and the commonality, in fact, the line from, oh, by the way, my added value this week is called The Vow, V-O-W, The Vow, and it is a docuseries on HBO about the NXIVM cult, and the thing that you learn is, I think, two things sort of converge whenever one of these cults forms. One is you have some sort of brilliant ideas, wisdom, insights, etc. At least the most compelling ones. That's how they get people to join, because there's some sort of brilliant insight there, right? And then you have kooky beliefs that are sort of mixed in with that, right?
Yeah.
And so the David Koresh thing is a great example of kooky beliefs, because eventually he's like, well, God has told me that only I can have sex with the women in our tribe, and the men must be monogamous, they must be celibate rather, and it becomes very strange very quickly.
Yeah, it's weird how it starts with some type of like good intention and with like a deep truth that gets uncovered, but then it gets mixed with all this
belief.
Yeah, the craziness. Yeah,
And so, Chris, nobody joins a cult is one of the lines in this docuseries.
I love that,
and that's true, right? Like, it's a guy who's in the cult who says no, and he's found out, like, oh, I've gone too far, I've got to get out, whatever, and he says, but no one joins a cult,
right?
You will never meet anyone who's looking to sign up for a cult,
right?
And yet, lots of people join cults, because they don't realize. In fact, maybe the time they joined it wasn't yet a cult.
Oh man!
And so we talked about how do we avoid that, but also I'm just fascinated because parts of this are so good and human and nourishing, and there are spiritual components and all of this, and then it's always tainted by something else.
An abuse of power, yeah. I mean, the desire to belong is so strong, isn't it? It's not surprising that people are drawn into that sort of thing. I mean, even in Wild Wild Country, did you not, I mean, especially the early episodes, did you not look at that and think, wow, that looks awesome, I would quite like to go there? I mean, definitely a part of it looked really, really good, and then it all started to, the wheels came off the wagon eventually, right? But in the beginning, it looks great.
Right. Yeah. The whole concept was, we're going to have a community to like show how a community can thrive, and they did a very good job of that in the beginning. Yeah, I totally agree.
And so I don't know, maybe the key is that you keep it below a certain threshold, and it can't be a cult as long as there's fewer than 10 people. Like, I don't know what it is, but that's certainly something that we want to avoid, right?
Yeah.
Real quick, for right here, right now, here's one thing that's going on in the life of the Minimalists. We have a new book coming out. Nourish, Balance, Thrive is actually mentioned in it briefly.
Oh, thank you.
It's called Love People Use Things. You can pre-order it. It really helps us out if you do pre-order it. The print book, the ebook, or the audiobook over at lovepeopleusethings.net. You can also see the beautiful trailer that Jordan put together for the book. It's called Love People Use Things. It'll be out this summer. But you can pre-order it now. Help us out a lot. Lovepeopleusethings.net. You can follow The Minimalists on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Minimalist. Chris, what are you on social media?
We don't really do social media.
No,
I sort of
look
gave
at
up on
him.
that after Cal Newport.
What a hipster. That's great, man.
Oh, come to one of our live podcast shows. Visit theminimalists.com/tour to find a city near you. You can find Chris over at nourishbalancethrive.com, and apparently you can email him at chris@nourishbalancethrive.com. If you have a question, comment, or minimalism tip for our podcast, email a voice memo to podcast@theminimalists.com. Comment on this episode, youtube.com/theminimalists. And if you want our show notes in your inbox, sign up for our email list over at theminimalists.com. You'll also receive our Simple Sunday emails. And if you leave here today with just one message, we hope it's this: love people and use things, because the opposite never works. Thanks for listening, y'all.
We'll see you next time.
Every little thing you think that you need, every little thing you think that you need, every little thing that's just feeding your greed. Oh, I bet that you'd be fine without it.